Private Ronald Phillips, 2nd 4th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private Arthur A. Parsons, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private William Paver, 2nd 4th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private William McCormick, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Lance Corporal Edward A. Miles, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment.
The names of soldiers from the 2nd, 4th and the 2nd 6th Battalions of the Gloucestershire Regiment who were lost during one of the most disastrous battles of World War I.
William John Samuel Marshall, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private George Frank Lupson, 2nd 6th Battalion.
Grandmother used to say, water wouldn't have harmed a fly. He really wasn't. He was a really lovely chap.
Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment.
There's lots of Raises still around because my great-uncle, my father's uncle, Trevor, who is still alive. And he still visits family.
Rosina and Tracy had relatives in the battle and are, along with many other families, awaiting the results of one of the biggest ever operations carried out in peacetime to recover and identify war dead from over 90 years ago.
It's a mild early October morning here in the northern French village of Fromelles. And just like any other northern French village, the atmosphere here is quiet, unassuming, and characteristically for rural France, it appears deserted. But the present-day serenity of Fromelles masks a bloody history when in July 1916, inexperienced soldiers from the Gloucestershire Regiment fought alongside other British and Australian troops who had just arrived in a disastrous battle which was to cost hundreds of lives.
In the early evening of Wednesday the 19th of July 1916, near the village of Fromelles in northern France, Australian and British infantry of two divisions attacked a 4,000-yard section of the German front line, centred on a notorious strongpoint called the Sugarloaf. Advancing over unfavourable ground, in clear view of resolute and expectant defenders, the attackers suffered terrible casualties in a matter of minutes. The action turned into a bloody catastrophe.
The British lost around about 1,200 casualties. The Australians lost a staggering 5,500. That's killed, wounded, missing.
Paul Cobb lives in Lechlade. He's written a book called Fromelles 1916, which tells the story of an event which has become known as the Forgotten Battle.
The whole purpose of the battle was to deter the Germans from transferring troops and artillery down to the Somme, where the main 1916 offensive was in full swing. So there was a British and Australian division given the task of attacking the German line and breaking through the German line, but not actually holding the territory. And the idea of this was to give the impression that there was another British offensive about to start up here in northern France. The battle start date kept on being put back because the artillery weren't ready, and the weather, as was often the case on the Western Front, was pretty bad, so the gunners couldn't register on their targets. And even up to about a day or so before the battle, there was still mist and low cloud over the battlefield, which at the best of times is quite marshy, low-lying ground, typical of French Flanders. And eventually, in the evening of the 19th of July, the troops went into action just before 6 o'clock. Both the British and the Australians attacked the German front line. Parts of the British troops on the British front, they broke through into the German front line, but eventually were forced out. On the Australian left, they also broke through the German line. They held it right through the night, whereas the British were out of the German line by probably about midnight. The Australians held on until 6, 7, 8 o'clock the following morning, but the Bavarians regrouped very, very effectively, called up reinforcements, and by certainly mid-morning, their front line was held in its entirety by them, and the only British and Australian troops left in the German lines were either casualties or prisoners of war.
The site of the battle was here at the quaintly named Pheasant Wood. In recent years, the land has been farmed, and because, for the Commonwealth forces, it wasn't a glorious victory, until recently, the battle has been buried in the annals of military history. That's not to say, though, that these woods don't provide the occasional reminder of the horrific past. Marshal Delabarre is the president of the local historical society here in Fromelles, as well as being the curator of the local museum.
After so long time, It can happen. Last year we walked the battlefield, and I will say like this, on the ground we could find two Austrian sun-rising badges, and for the colours are still on the ground after over 90 years. But on the British side, you can still locate or follow the trenches. With my partner, I think a couple of days ago, we walked the battlefield on that section along the German trench, and we could find some shrapnel, bullets, and you can also follow traces in winter where was, in fact, the British front line, and still pick up, I think, some relics of that time. But I can say, I think we have collected or picked up, I think, some original things from the Gloucestershire Regiment involved during the Battle of Fromelles.
But for the past few months, the land at Pheasant Wood has become the site of a major archaeological dig, following the discovery of burial pits there. When the dig began back in May, the World War I historian Peter Barton described the events which led up to the remains being laid there.
If we'd been here on the 22nd of July 1916, we would have seen a little train pushed by German soldiers of maybe 4 trucks loaded with British and Australian dead come through the corner of that wood and stop just where the corner of our compound is. From there, the men were taken off and put into a series of 8 pits. This excavation is unique in First World War archaeology and First World War history. The largest group burial that's ever been undertaken before is 20 men near Arras a few years ago. So here you're talking many multiples of that. I don't know any other First World War projects on this scale.
As we have heard, the Gloucestershire Regiment fought alongside the Australian Army, which was taking part in its first offensive of the war. The heavy losses, more than 5,000, which the Australians suffered, moved a retired teacher to put the battle back into the history books. The project manager for the dig and the consequent identification of remains is David Richardson of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission.
What spurred the project was the research done by Lambis Inglesos. I think he's been working on the project for about 10 years. He is part of the Friends of the 15th Brigade, and he's an individual with no personal relationship with the people that are buried here or casualties at Fromelles, but somebody that really has crusaded to get these guys, I suppose, excavated, exhumed and reburied in a proper cemetery. And as a result of the work that he did and the involvement he had with the Australian government, they commissioned some radar surveys of the ground, which proved there was something there. And then last summer, they actually commissioned an initial survey on the area of Pheasant Wood and found that there were remains in the graves.
The operation to remove the remains has now come to an end.
This ploughed field that we have in front of us here is where the mass graves were. Now that we've completed the excavation, all the holes that we dug have been backfilled, and that area has been ploughed and sown with grass. So it looks very different today to how it looked a few weeks ago.
Dr. Louise Lowe from Oxford Archaeology is the archaeologist in charge.
If you were here a few weeks ago, you'd have seen 8 large pits, large rectangles about 1.5 metres wide, 10 metres long, and they were laid out parallel to each other, just adjacent to Pheasant Wood.
When you mention mass graves, a lot of people may think holes with bodies thrown in. Was that the case as far as this was concerned?
No, certainly not. I mean, mass grave is a term used here just to describe a group of burials in one grave. In this case, these individuals have been laid out in a very organised manner. In each grave we had 2 layers of individuals. They were buried along the length of the graves, and broadly speaking they were buried head to toe, although we did have variations in all of the graves.
And what sort of conditions were the bodies in when you found them?
Well, the bodies themselves, every set of remains was fully skeletonized, and the bones were very well preserved. Those individuals buried closest to the Pheasant Wood had suffered a bit more taphonomic damage, and by that I mean where tree roots had grown up into the grave, the bones had perhaps become a little bit more fragmented and a little bit worn.
With the dig over, the focus turned to the identification of the remains.
Dear Mrs Clark, thank you for your inquiry about your great-uncle. 5139 Private Water John Deverell was born in Avon-Cliff, Bristol.
Many families, both here in Britain and in Australia, are now awaiting the outcome of DNA tests to determine whether their relative was one of the soldiers buried in the mass graves of Pheasant Wood.
November in 1915. His number was changed in 1916 to 201698 when the Army reconstructed the numbering system. During the Great War, Water served the 2nd and 4th Battalion, the Gloucester Regiment.
Rosina Clark lives in Westbury in Wiltshire, and her great-uncle, Walter John Deverell, enlisted in the 2nd 4th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment before being sent to the trenches of northern France.
Grandmother used to say, Walter wouldn't have harmed a fly. He really wouldn't. He was a really lovely chap. And I think they were all devastated, when the news came through. He had 3 sisters. One was my grandmother, Rosina, and Helen and Auntie Elsie. And I'm sure at that time there was, to find your only brother sort of going through a battle. And when you think in the May of 1916, he was alive up on Salisbury Plain, and by the July of that year, he died.
Now, you've done a lot of research here, haven't you?
Yeah.
So what sorts of things have you found in connection with Walter?
Well, not a great deal, really, because you see all of Bran's sisters have died. So the only ones I've got now is my 2 aunties and 2 uncles. And Auntie Gwen is going to be the one that has her DNA taken eventually. And of course, none of these was born, you see, when Walter was alive. So I've only got sort of hearsay from the family, really, of what Gran did tell them at the time when they were younger.
Like Rosina and her family, Tracy Leslie and her father Alan Linton, who live in Ystrad Mynach in Mid Glamorgan, are reliant on older relatives for information on their ancestor Albert Rasey, who served in the 2nd 6th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment before he died.
The Fromelles battle was brought to my attention by a researcher from an online internet forum called the Great War Forum. He actually was trying to research all the missing soldiers through Genes Reunited and Ancestry.co.uk. He noticed I had an Albert Rasey in my tree, sent me an email and asked me to check if it was the same Albert and would I mind getting in touch with the Ministry of Defence if it was. So I did, and it was. So I did.
The first I knew of this was when my daughter brought it up.
So what have you been able to find out since about Albert?
Quite a lot. We found his commemorative, that he was commemorated on the Wall of Remembrance in Louvre. And then last week I went to visit Trevor, who is Albert's nephew. He's the last of his generation. He remembers the family talking about Albert just as my little brother Albert, who was killed in the war. Nothing was ever mentioned, that his body was never found, so they'd always assumed that he was killed, and he had an appropriate memorial out in France. So he had 3 other brothers who went out to France, but they all came back.
Gloucestershire Regiment. Private Ernest Lacey, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment.
The task of coordinating the identification of the remains and connecting them with living relatives has fallen to staff and scientists based at Imjam Barracks at Innsworth.
Croft James, 2nd 4th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment.
Tracy and Rosina have submitted their family trees, a factor which DNA advisor to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Dr. Peter Jones, says is the primary key to identifying remains and placing them into family histories.
DNA is quite a remarkable molecule. It survives extremes of conditions, and the mere fact that this DNA has survived for the best part of 100 years in the ground means we'll be able to isolate the DNA and then profile that DNA and then match that DNA profile with living relatives with the hope of finding the identification of the individuals buried.
The missing part of the jigsaw is the living.
Yes, without the living this will not work. We need the living relatives, and we don't just need any relative. Unfortunately, we're looking for specifically the direct maternal and direct paternal lineage of these individuals. And if we have those people and we have the DNA profiles of the soldiers, then we can put the 2 together and hopefully find an identity. But we need also corroborating evidence from anthropology, historical sources, family information, anything really that the living relatives can provide to really produce a full picture. It's not just DNA is not just going to be taken at face value, because strange things can happen with DNA.
Some of the bodies dug up, it's believed, were very young people. It's thought some were as young as 15. There's not likely to be a lot of DNA lineage beyond those particular people, though. So how do you get over that hurdle?
Most of the people who were killed were probably in their 20s and didn't have any direct family. Most of them weren't married. But what we're looking at is their brothers and sisters. So it would be the great aunts, great uncles, nephews, cousins side of the family. With the maternal lineage, it's fairly straightforward. If you've got the same surname as the person who's killed there, there's a very good chance you're one of the direct paternal lineages. The maternal is a little bit more complicated, because you have to look at the sisters and her children, and her children only pass the mitochondrial markers on from daughter to children, and then their children, it must be the only daughter that passes it on. So quite often lines die out because a daughter passes it on, but the sons can't pass on that DNA. They marry somebody else, and that's where the line is lost. So the maternal is much more of a challenge than the paternal.
But it's not only the presence of DNA which will help the Service and Personnel Department at Innsworth find relatives of the dead. Many of the bodies were found with personal possessions. Archaeology manager Dr. Louise Lowe again.
We always expected and knew that we'd find personal items, but it's still very moving when you come across them. I think the leather heart that we had, that had the lock of hair inside, for me that was the most poignant find that we came upon. But there've certainly been many others. We found quite a few Bibles, some with passages underlined. We found a French phrase book, French-English phrase book, and we found quite a lot of crucifixes, and all of these things revealed the very human side to the battle, which is very moving.
As for David Richardson, the project's director, he's been moved by one specific find.
There's one item in particular which, a lot of people have said has been the most moving, and it's the train ticket which we found in a gas mask, and it was a train ticket from Fremantle to Perth, a return ticket, and of course the return portion never used.
All of these will contribute to making up a picture of the individuals found at the Pheasant Wood graves. But according to forensic anthropologist Professor Margaret Cox, the scientific advisor to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, identification isn't an exact science.
The geographical origin, the method that we'll use for that is largely the uniforms, because even if someone's wearing an Australian uniform, they may have been British or could have been from a number of other countries. We can also tell something about ancestry from a number of features, such as the measurements of the face and skull, which are quite distinct for people who come from different ancestral groups. So we're applying a whole load of statistics to all of those measurements, which are pulling out any people who are of non-European ancestry, for example. And also the DNA will pick up people of Jewish ancestry, of Romani ancestry, or with other than European ancestry. So there's a whole suite of methods really that are being used for that.
Now obviously there were British and Australian troops involved in the Fromelles battle, but Australian has a European base as the people who came over.
Yes.
How difficult has that made your job?
Well, it means that using things like isotopes, for example, which you might use if these Australian soldiers were known to have been born and brought up in Australia, is a non-starter for this project. There's no point in doing it. So it makes it a bit more difficult. But so it does mean that for where they were fighting, which force they were fighting for, we're reliant on artefacts largely.
But the families of Private Walter Deverill of the 2nd 4th Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment and Private Albert Rasey of the 2nd 6th remain ever hopeful that their relatives will be amongst those whose identity is eventually revealed.
We're just hoping that when they do it, that they will be able to find that Walter was there. I mean, how we shall feel if they don't find anything, I don't know. It's going to be a little bit emotional, I think.
Well, I'm ex-military myself, and my husband is. And I think knowing that somebody so young went away, never came back, and that nobody ever really knew what happened to him, I think that sense of closure, I mean, it does mean slightly more to me, I think, because of my military background, because I was in the Royal Navy. And you hear of this, especially now, with all these young boys in Afghanistan, at least people know what's happened. You've got the news coverage, you've got more records now.
Private Arthur A. Parsons, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private William Paver, 2nd 4th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private
Where I am
William
now is
McCall.
no man's land. It's typical northern France flat land made up of muddy clay which sticks to absolutely everything that comes into contact with it. It's visible for as far as the eye can see as the harvest has been gathered in and the fields have been ploughed. Nearby is a statue of an Australian soldier carrying another one on his back. This is the Cobber's statue and it commemorates the 3 days after the Battle of Fromelles, when the Commonwealth forces were allowed by the Bavarians to gather up their dead and wounded from the battlefield. An information board nearby reads, "On the day the guns fell silent on the Western Front, 11th of November 1918, Charles Bean, Australia's official historian, was standing where Australia's war in France had begun, on the battlefield of Fromelles. Here, in 24 hours, on the 19th and 20th of July 1916, the Australian 5th Division suffered more than 5,300 casualties. Just down the single-track road from here, there's VC Corner, where 410 Aussie soldiers are buried, and a wall bears the name of 1,294 more Australians who died at Fromelles but were never found. But to date, as far as the 250 bodies found in the mass graves at Fromelles are concerned, there is no permanent memorial.
My name is Roger Bird and I work for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission.
That is until now.
This is actually going to be the cemetery where the soldiers who have been discovered over in the Pheasant Wood are going to be buried. They're going to all be buried individually and named headstones if we can find out through DNA testing who they are. If not, they'll be just buried as unknown Australians or unknown British soldiers.
The first set of remains is due to be buried in February next year, with an official opening of the Fromelles Cemetery in July.
Hundreds of soldiers died on that ill-fated summer's day in July 1916. Until now, they've been little more than a name on a memorial somewhere in the northern French countryside. But soon, each and every soldier found in these graves here at Pheasant Wood will be remembered for the part he played in the bloody fight for freedom, whether or not his remains are identified by name.
John P. Broomfield, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private Walter E. Burrows, 2nd 4th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment.
The young lads there are aged from 15 years of age and then on to 40. When you think of a 15-year-old today doing that sort of thing, it just mind boggles, doesn't it? It really does.
That was my grandmother's brother. You know, I remember my grandmother. I remember my Uncle Tom, who was also blinded in the war by mustard gas, who lived with my grandmother. It's fitting and right that he should be remembered and have a memorial.
It obviously meant something to my father's grandparents as well, because as they Lily named her next child after Albert. So it obviously meant something to her.
2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private Herbert Mason, 2nd 4th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private William John Samuel Marshall, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private George Frank Lupson, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Lieutenant William John Langford, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Private Ernest Lacey, 2nd 6th Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment. Lance Corporal Walter A. King, 2nd 6th Battalion,